Welcome to 7 advanced tips for every Nefer main, the series in which I assume you already know the basics of a character so that we can dive deeper into more advanced topics, mechanics, and generally niche aspects that are often not talked about in a guide video. With Nefer we already found something very important during her early access, a simple way to cancel the animation of her charge attack, so for the first tip we will try to expand on that. The concept is very simple. A complete attack string for Nefer will last about 10 seconds, if we add the burst around 12 instead. This is generally too much for many teams, especially with long burst animations. However, during early access we discovered that we don't have to play out the entire animation of a charger attack. It is possible to interrupt it with a dash and have the Lunar Bloom damage come out regardless. The exact moment is right after the first leg kick. An entire charge attack consists of 2 danger hits and 3 Lunar Blooms. Cancelling so early means that we will lose 1 danger hit. That's the second kick, but it really doesn't matter as much for damage. We can dash cancel every single charge attack without ever reaching the dash cooldown. You might know all of this, especially if you watched my previous Nefer video. So let's go a bit deeper. One thing you probably notice, and it's so apparent in the current rotation of Stygian, is that she can miss. On Sigurd it's so annoying. He can dash away, has quick iframes, and even a catching burst that makes him immune to damage for a bit. And while there are no real solutions for an enemy having invincibility frames, I found something that helps mitigate the damage loss against mobile targets, or even better, AoE content. You see, the Lunar Bloom hits coming from her shades are only happening in the same location as her main body is able to hit. They have no auto-targeting whatsoever. They just spawn where you are. The first 2 Lunar Blooms are connected to the first danger hit coming directly from Nefer, while the last one is connected to her second hit. But as we know, it happens even if we cancel the attack. This means that if the enemy moves or is defeated during the first attack and we dash cancel, the last Lunar Bloom, which is your strongest one by the way, will happen where she is, likely resulting in no damage at all. So when the enemy is moving so much, or you know it's not going to be in range, a small tech we can use is to simply stop doing dash cancels. This won't always work as the enemy can still be out of range, but when it does, her second kick will be able to adjust its position and recover the last Lunar Bloom. So even when Nefer is played at her best, we should still adjust our gameplay between using the dash cancels or not. In AoE content, this can be extremely useful, but even in Stygian it can help. Moving on, dashing is not the only way to cancel a charge attack. There are 2.5 more ways to cancel them. Jumping, which is slower and less convenient unless in dire need of stamina. At that point, I'd generally just let the charge attack fully play. And burst, which simply interrupts the animation without stopping the Lunar Blooms from happening. Dash and burst will generally be the preferred way, but the dash can also be used to switch out quite a bit faster than we usually can. And this is useful for the last charge attack of a skill, making Nefer rotations even shorter. But here I had to dive a bit deeper, because switching out so fast means that we can do so before her last Lunar Bloom happens. And this hit might lose particular buffs that are given only to the character currently on field. There are quite a few. From what I could test, this applies to Nahida's Burst, Inef's Ascension 4, Danger Traveler's Ascension 1, Aino C1 and C6. I couldn't test it, but probably C2 Silali as well. These buffs are lost on the last Lunar Bloom if you dash cancel plus switch. And while researching this video, I found out that buffs like Diona's Burst and Kolei C4 for Elemental Mastery, or GMC crit rate buff, instead either linger for a bit or work for some other reason. As an example, Diona's C6 always has 2 extra seconds of duration once applied to a character. All of these small adjustments make Nefer a character that is extremely simple to play, remember that holding attack will basically perform her entire combo, into one that has many possibilities of adapting to certain teams, builds or scenarios. We can switch in the middle of our rotation, between our 2 skills to refresh something like Instructor, or we can insert a burst in many spots, in the middle, at the end, or simply when we don't want to wait for the Verdant Dew generation. One last note of gameplay I have is on this burst. As you probably know, Nefer will constantly accumulate Veil of Falsehood stacks. These are very important for your Lunar Bloom. but the burst will consume them to increase its damage, so be mindful of ideally using it when you know there are going to be enough bloom cores to regain the buffs on the next charger attack. Now let's move on to some different topics. I want to go through the team I like to play the most currently and explain the reasoning of my rotation and artifact choices. We can extrapolate a lot of details and tips out of simply watching some gameplay, and many of these are used in any team you might be playing. So let's look at the builds first. In this team, I will generally equip Lauma with Silk and Moon, Nahida with Deep Food, and Aino with Instructor. Lauma has Silk and Moon since she really much enjoys the 20% energy recharge, but of course this is interchangeable with Deep Food depending on which one offers you the most energy recharge and elemental mastery. And that's a big focus here. Creep value for Lauma in this team doesn't really matter. She won't be casting her old skill, so what we really want is enough energy to burst and as much elemental mastery as you possibly can gather, to the point that you can trade any amount of crit value from your artifacts if it means getting a little bit more EM. This elemental mastery will be converted into flat damage to every single Lunar Bloom, and in our case will be multiplied by Nefer's crit value. The stronger your Nefer, the more you want elemental mastery on Lauma. Plus, she will precisely buff 18 Lunar Blooms, which is exactly how many Nefer is getting each rotation. It's no surprise that these two characters synergize well. For Lauma, I recommend leveling up both the skill and burst as much as possible. There can be a priority, but it's small enough to depend mainly on your build. For Nahida, we simply skill to keep Deepwood or Silk and Moon up, and we burst to give elemental mastery to Nefer. Simple, right? Well, it doesn't completely stop there. Nahida's elemental mastery share is 25% of whoever has the most elemental mastery, capped at 250. And that might create the misconception of being able to build other stats on Nahida, maybe even crit and danger damage. However, in this particular team, and this is also important for many other characters, we still want to build as much elemental mastery as possible. And that's because of the Nod-Krai Resonance. 1000 elemental mastery equals to 22.5% Lunar Bloom damage to your Nefer. That's about a 4% damage increase. And this resonance has some pretty annoying rules. Let's take the example of a team with two characters that are not from Nod-Krai. Well, public service announcement. The Nod-Krai Resonance only cares about the last cast of skill or burst, meaning that these two will cancel each other's buff. When I cast Nahida's burst with her nice 1200 elemental mastery, I get 27% lunar damage. But using Xingqiu right after means that I replace it with his not so great HP stat. Now, if you happen to have a crappy, barely functionable instructor set, and his HP was around 10,000, well, you now downgraded the lunar damage that you're doing exactly for when it mattered the most, going from 27% to just 6 in this case. And this applies to every character not from Nod-Krai, as each element has a strict single stat it cares about. Now, it's not such a huge boost that you should start changing things up drastically, especially if the order of a team matters for other reasons. Instructor uptime here is clearly a winner, but it makes you understand that the order of execution is important and that some stats might be useful even if the character doesn't usually care. Technically, a cookie should have as much attack as possible, Xingqiu as much HP, and so on. Moving on, for the Hydra slot, in this case Aino, the main point I want to emphasize is that Instructor can only be on this character in this team. Remember that danger units in this kind of teams will not actually trigger a reaction, since the enemy will likely have a danger aura. The same applies most of the time to cryo units, while instead someone like Aino is guaranteed to work. Also remember that Instructor can only be triggered on field, which also means there is a difference between casting Aino's skill or burst first. More on this later. Let's cover a rotation and explain what's happening here. The order of this team is generally Nahida, Lauma, and then Aino. Nahida's burst is extended by the presence of one Hydra, and even a level 1 will last long enough. Lauma's burst, however, if used too early, can expire during Nefer's attacks. And that's a big deal. It has a duration of 15 seconds, we're running rotations that are a bit longer, so opening with it is a big no. Her skill also has a duration, but it lingers on the enemy for 10 entire extra seconds, so generally we can use it before the burst. Now, Aino as a last option is unfortunate. We wouldn't generate enough earth end use, and that's really annoying. although it's mostly a problem for the first rotation or two. And since Instigen starting with her burst is not something we can do so easily, we don't really have a perfect way to fix this. We could cast it before, but then instructor would suffer. And here I want to point out two mistakes I've seen being done trying to fix these issues. First, assuming that you can use one Nino skill on the setup and one later is generally not great. Each has 10 seconds of cooldown, making your rotation longer than your Nefer wants. And then casting her burst without her skill doesn't mean we're getting instructor to work. It's very easy to swap before the burst ever does any damage, thus never triggering instructor. That's why I like to overbuild energy recharge so that ideally I burst into skill, which means that I get the instructor trigger right before I go to Nefer. This, coupled with good dash cancels, can make instructor cover 5 out of 6 star attacks. This 4-star set is still holding up really well after 5 years. I know this rotation talk might be a bit harder for some new players, but the main point I want to emphasize is that Nefer wants to be generally swapped to every 18 seconds. That's the time she needs to get back her 2 skills. And since their cooldown starts as soon as one is used, we can even be faster than 18 seconds, with good rotations and gameplay, allowing us to front load some of her damage. It's not something sustainable in the long run, but it will take a while for Nefer to run into cooldown issues. Now for the last tip, I want to show all the calcs that made it or did not into my previous video. Pause if you need. Here's the weapon and constellations, here's the artifacts, here's your substats priority, here's how much damage you gain by leveling up all the way to 90 your Nefer. Yes, it's wasted more on XP, and here's talent priority for Lauma when played with Nefer. Lastly, I think we kind of have everything about this character now. All that is left is for Hoyo to release new teammates to either make her more comfortable or even stronger. But I'm personally already satisfied with her mechanical gameplay, which I find very fun, and her power level. I just wish we had more team options. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know which character you want me to cover next, and like and sub if you learned something new. I'll see you in the next video.